Rowan stood at the back of the chapel, her hands clenched tightly around the funeral program someone had reluctantly handed her. The pages trembled in her grasp, not from grief, though it was there, raw and gnawing, but from disbelief. Her name wasn't listed, not among the surviving children, not in the acknowledgments, not in the short biography that painted her mother's life in tidy paragraphs. It was as if she had never existed. The air was heavy with lilies and murmured condolences, but no one looked her in the eye. Some guests glanced at her and quickly looked away. Others simply didn't recognize her. Callista had ensured that. Her older sister, standing near the casket like a queen at court, accepted every tearful hug, every reverent whisper, with a quiet dignity that masked cold calculation. The only daughter, she'd said earlier to a reporter, her voice soft, reverent. Mom and I were inseparable. She left everything to me, as she always intended. Only daughter. The words echoed inside Rowan like a scream. She was Celeste Lynn's child, too. Her youngest, the one who stayed up late listening to her mother's lectures on molecular biology, the one who sang to her through the long nights of chemotherapy. She had brought the mint tea when no one else could stomach the hospital stench, had learned how to braid her mother's hair so gently it wouldn't tug on the fragile scalp beneath. But none of that mattered now. None of it was written down. None of it had a place. The slideshow flickered on the screen behind the podium. Photos of Callista and Celeste filled the screen. Holidays, birthdays, award ceremonies. Rowan watched herself disappear, frame by frame, erased not just from memory, but from history. She stepped out into the hallway, chest tight, trying to breathe. Her mother's death had already broken something inside her. But this denial of her place in Celeste's life, was a second death, colder and more deliberate. And it came at the hands of the very person who should have stood beside her in grief. Was this what legacy meant? A carefully curated narrative that left out the inconvenient, the imperfect, the unloved? Rowan wiped her eyes and reached for her phone. She scrolled through old voicemails, desperate to hear her mother's voice. One message, from just a month before her death, played softly. My Rue, I don't say it enough, but you've always been my quiet strength. I hope you know how much I love you. A sob escaped her lips. They could erase her name from paper, from photographs, from cold formalities, but they couldn't erase that voice, that bond, that truth. Rowan looked back toward the chapel door. The silence inside was polished and false. She would not reclaim her place through confrontation. She would do it by remembering, by living, by telling her mother's story as it really was. Messy, beautiful, painful, whole. No inheritance could compare to that. She was her mother's daughter. Rowan stared at the document spread out on the polished table, her heart pounding like a warning drum. The signature at the bottom was unmistakably hers, but not like this. Not with those words, not with that date. Her fingers trembled as she traced the ink, the memories crashing down in bitter waves. 3 years ago, she had signed a temporary power of attorney, trusting her sister Callista to handle Lintech's administrative tasks while she took a leave to care for their ailing mother. It was supposed to be temporary, just paperwork to keep things running smoothly, while Rowan stepped away to be a daughter, not a CEO. She hadn't read every line. She hadn't needed to. Callista was her sister, or so she believed. Now that same document had resurfaced, amended, notarized under suspicious circumstances, and filed with the state. It gave Callista complete control over Lintech's intellectual property, its brand, its future. Rowan had been wiped off the company's charter as cleanly as her name had been erased from their mother's memorial. Her life's work, her sacrifices, the years she spent building the company from scratch, it had all been signed away in a betrayal inked with trust. The betrayal was surgical in its precision. Callista had waited. She hadn't struck when Rowan was watching. She had waited for grief to dull her sister's instincts, for exhaustion to cloud her clarity. And when Rowan was bowed under the weight of loss, Callista had filed the papers, secured the patents, and transferred the shares. Now she stood tall behind Lintech's new logo, presenting herself as the visionary force behind its innovation, when it was Rowan who had poured her soul into every line of code, every system, every sleepless night. Rowan wanted to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. It wasn't just about the company. It was about something deeper, something sacred that had been violated. Trust, family, memory. Her mother's dream, their shared legacy. She looked out the office window, where the Lintech sign glowed against the Oregon sky. It still bore the initials of their parents, Lynn and Tecton. It still carried the name that once united them, but now it was a hollow emblem of what had been stolen. Rowan pulled out an old notebook from her bag, the one her mother had given her in graduate school. Inside, between scribbled ideas and diagrams, was a quote Celeste had written: "Power gained through deceit is always borrowed. It will ask to be returned." Tears filled her eyes. This wasn't over. Callista might have taken the company, but she couldn't take the truth. She couldn't erase the vision, the brilliance, the integrity that had built Lintech from a basement startup into a national name. Rowan would fight, not just for the business, but for everything it stood for. She would reclaim it, not through vengeance, but through clarity, evidence, and unwavering resolve. Because Lintech wasn't just a company. The lawyer's voice droned on in the quiet room, his tone impersonal, practiced. Rowan sat frozen in the high-backed chair, her eyes fixed on the will in his hands. Every word felt like a cut, a measured, deliberate unraveling of everything she believed was unshakable. Callista sat beside her, composed in a black silk dress, legs crossed, hands folded neatly. She didn't look at Rowan, not once, just kept her gaze on the table, as if this were another boardroom negotiation, and not the moment their mother's legacy was being rewritten. The original will, Rowan had read it. Their mother, Dr. Celeste Lynn, had always believed in fairness. She had worked tirelessly to build Lintech and made it clear, again and again, that both daughters would inherit equal shares of the company, the estate, and the voting rights. She used to say, "You balance each other. One sees vision, one sees detail. Together, you're stronger than me." But now, the revised document painted a different picture. Submitted just days before Celeste was hospitalized, it stripped Rowan of her stake in the company, revoked her voting rights, and removed her as a beneficiary to nearly all assets. What was left? A framed photograph of her and her mother, taken in the Lintech lab during happier times, and a transfer of $70,000, a sum that felt more like hush money than an inheritance. "Surely there's a mistake," Rowan whispered. This isn't what she wanted." The lawyer cleared his throat, glancing briefly at Callista, who remained silent. This was the most recent, legally binding version. Signed and notarized, Rowan's breath caught in her chest. She remembered the week in question. Her mother's health had taken a turn, and Rowan had been in and out of hospitals, pharmacies, and sleepless nights at her bedside. Callista had managed the paperwork. Of course she had. That was her role. The manager, the handler, the older sister who always seemed to have things under control. But Rowan had never imagined this. The photograph sat in a slim envelope on the table. Rowan picked it up with trembling fingers. Her mother's arm was around her, both of them smiling in lab coats, covered in scribbles and coffee stains. It had been a good day, a real day, the kind that didn't need signatures or legal declarations to prove love. Tears welled in Rowan's eyes. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't even about the company. Not entirely. It was about trust, about being seen, about not being erased from the narrative of her own life, her own family. What Callista had done was more than betrayal. It was theft of identity, of belonging. But, as the silence deepened, Rowan took a slow breath. She still had the truth. She still had her memory, her voice, her story. And she would speak it, clearly, fiercely, in every room that tried to silence her. Because love doesn't vanish with ink. And justice, though delayed, does not forget. Rowan sat alone in the back row of the Lintech Anniversary Gala, surrounded by glittering lights and applause. A massive screen dominated the stage, playing a sleek, edited documentary that celebrated 20 years of innovation. Her company, her life's work, was being honored. But as the montage unfolded, Rowan felt a strange sense of disorientation, like walking through a dream where she could see everything but touch nothing, because she wasn't in it. Not once. There were clips from the early days, team meetings in the cramped garage, whiteboards scrawled with equations, prototypes humming on folding tables. But in every frame, it was Callista who stood at the center. Callista, explaining breakthroughs that Rowan had conceived. Callista, shaking hands with investors Rowan had brought in. Callista, smiling modestly as the narrator called her the brilliant mind behind Lintech's technological leap. It was as if Rowan had never existed. The video ended. Applause thundered through the ballroom. People stood to toast Callista's visionary leadership, her pioneering innovation, her unmatched brilliance. Rowan clapped too, quietly, mechanically, trying to hide the storm rising inside her. Later, as she wandered through the event archive on Lintech's internal portal, the devastation deepened. Every mention of her name had been scrubbed clean. Internal memos she'd authored were now credited to senior strategy advisors. Her photo was gone from the founding team page. Even the original blueprints of their flagship platform, the system she'd architected line by line, now bore Callista's initials. They had rewritten history, and Callista had led it. Rowan leaned back in her chair, blinking against the sting of betrayal. This wasn't just about pride or credit. It was about truth. She had built Lintech in the quiet hours, when no one was watching. She had stayed up for nights debugging a single line of code that would power entire industries. She had risked everything, money, health, even her relationship with their mother, to keep the company alive during its darkest years. But in the story now being told, she was no one, a ghost, an outsider. She thought of her mother again. How proud Celeste had been when Rowan presented their first live demo. How she'd whispered, "This is your legacy." And now it was being handed, gift-wrapped, to someone else. Rowan closed the laptop and let her head fall into her hands. The grief was layered. Her mother, her company, her name, all slipping through her fingers. But something deeper stirred beneath the sorrow. Resolve. They could erase her from a screen. They could edit her out of speeches and bios and boardroom minutes. But they couldn't delete her truth. They couldn't replicate her mind, her integrity, or the years she gave when no one else believed. She would not beg for acknowledgement. She would rise, rebuild, and speak. Not just to reclaim her name, but to remind the world that the truest legacies aren't built on spotlight, but on substance. And one day, when the real story was told, her name would not be forgotten. Rowan moved quietly, deliberately, like someone walking through the ruins of something once sacred, gathering fragments before the wind could carry them away. In the weeks after the gala, after the forged will and the silent erasure of her name, she stopped pleading for explanations. Instead, she began listening, watching, collecting. She knew there would be no justice unless she built it herself, brick by brick, with truth as her only weapon. It started with an old email, one she'd forgotten she'd even sent. Tucked away in an archived folder, it was a technical memo from 4 years ago, detailing the encryption module she had designed for Lintech's first commercial release. The tone was unmistakably hers. Precise, understated, brilliant. And at the bottom, in time-stamped metadata, was the clearest proof of authorship. That one email became the first thread. She pulled. Using a personal backup drive she had stashed away years ago, just in case, Rowan began to retrieve internal memos, code version histories, project proposals in her handwriting. There was a draft of the company's strategic roadmap she'd written by hand in her mother's kitchen, still bearing Celeste's notes in the margins. "So proud of you, Ro. This is the future." Then came the will. Not the version Callista had submitted in court, but the one Rowan remembered, tucked into a faded blue folder in a locked cabinet at their childhood home. She found it buried behind old tax papers, still folded neatly in the original envelope. Her name was there, side by side with Callista's. Equal shares, equal say. And in the margins of the signature page, written in their mother's familiar cursive, a note. My daughters built this together. I trust them both. Rowan's fingers trembled as she held the page, a wave of grief and validation crashing over her at once. Still, it wasn't enough. She reached out to former colleagues, engineers, interns, even the quiet receptionist who had watched Lintech grow from a dream into a titan. One by one, they responded. Some sent screenshots of emails or forwarded drafts that had been stripped of her name. Others agreed to testify, to sign sworn statements that they had seen Rowan design, lead, and create. One retired developer broke down in tears during their call. I always wondered why you disappeared, she whispered. We all knew it was your system, but Callista, she said you wanted out. That lie cut deeper than Rowan expected, but she didn't stop. She cataloged everything, dated it, archived it, built a timeline so clean, so devastating in its clarity, that no courtroom or boardroom could ignore it. It wasn't about revenge, it never had been. It was about reclaiming her truth, her voice, her place. Late one night, alone in her apartment, she looked at the growing binder of evidence spread across her table. It wasn't just proof, it was a resurrection. Rowan had been erased. Now she would be remembered. Not as a victim, but as a woman who refused to let lies stand where legacy should. The boardroom at Lintech was colder than Rowan remembered. Sleek, modern, glass-paneled, but sterile, stripped of the warmth it once held when her mother still sat at the head of the table, her voice calm and visionary. Now that seat belonged to Callista, and Rowan stood before them all, no longer silent. She placed the sealed envelope onto the center of the table with quiet precision. The room stilled. Around her sat the board of directors, executives, legal counsel, and department heads, many of whom had watched her grow up in the shadow of Lintech's rise. They had called her a prodigy once. Now, most barely met her eyes. I won't waste your time, Rowan said, her voice steady. Inside that envelope is the truth. Callista shifted in her seat, the corner of her mouth twitching. Rowan continued. The original will, metadata records of unauthorized edits, witness statements, copies of internal communications, and a clause in the company's charter, written by my mother herself, that states, any agreement, transfer, or structural amendment obtained through fraud is subject to immediate revocation. No one spoke. The silence pressed in, thick and electric. She reached into her briefcase and withdrew another document, a side-by-side comparison of the forged will and the original. She slid it down the table. This is what was submitted after my mother fell ill. It omits my name, rewrites our partnership, and reassigns full ownership to Callista. What you see in the margins, these notes, that handwriting, that's my mother's. Dated a month before the forgery. It proves intent. It proves what she wanted. A few board members leaned in, scanning the page. Eyes widened. Whispers began. Rowan looked directly at Callista now. You told them I walked away, that I didn't want the company, that I was unfit. You made sure my name was erased from everything, from documents, from memories, even from the story of our own mother's passing. Her voice wavered, but didn't break. But I never left. You forced me out. You used my trust, my grief, and a moment of exhaustion to take what we built together. And now, I'm here to take it back. A beat of silence. Then another. Callista finally spoke, her tone clipped. You have no legal standing. You signed those rights away. Rowan didn't flinch. Under coercion, and under a false pretense, with documents altered after the fact, which makes every signature after that moment invalid. She turned to the board. I am not here to divide this company. I am here to protect its legacy, my mother's legacy, and mine. Everything in that envelope has been reviewed by an independent legal team. The clause on fraudulent dealings renders Callista's amendments null and void, effective immediately. No one applauded. No one needed to. The silence that followed spoke volumes. A reckoning had begun. Rowan took a breath, not out of exhaustion, but release. For the first time in years, she was not speaking through the veil of grief, betrayal, or fear. She was speaking from truth. And this time, they heard her. The announcement came in a brief, calculated statement on Lintech's official channels. Callista Lin has stepped down as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately to pursue personal projects and new ventures. But the truth was louder. In the weeks following Rowan's presentation to the board, the tides turned swiftly. The legal department moved with quiet authority, invoking the very clause Celeste Lin had once embedded in the company's governance, a safeguard against betrayal. The evidence was too overwhelming to ignore. Tampered documents, altered wills, silent coercion. The illusion Callista had built, so polished on the surface, cracked wide open beneath the weight of Rowan's truth. The board voted. It wasn't dramatic, just a single signature from each member on a page that, once completed, suspended Callista from her role pending full investigation. She didn't fight it. Not in that room. But outside those walls, a different story took shape. The PR team released the prepared statement, carefully worded to protect the company's image. No blame, no scandal, just a smooth transition. Rowan watched the announcement go live from her apartment, alone. No champagne, no celebration, just silence and breath. But the world wasn't silent. Within hours, former employees and tech journalists began connecting the dots. The documents Rowan had presented, public now through anonymous uploads, spread like wildfire. Old colleagues came forward with stories. Leaked emails began to surface, screenshots, comparisons. Her truth, once buried, was now visible to the world. She wasn't seeking vengeance, only clarity. But clarity has power. This wasn't a resignation, one tech blogger wrote. This was a reckoning. The headlines followed. From erased to empowered, the quiet storm behind Lintech's shakeup. Sister against sister, the truth behind the Lin legacy. The forgotten co-founder who took her place back. Rowan stayed out of the spotlight. She didn't grant interviews, didn't issue personal statements. But her silence wasn't absence. It was strength. The truth spoke loudly enough now. Behind the scenes, Callista fought to control the damage. But with each revelation, the foundation beneath her crumbled. Investors demanded answers. Shareholders demanded accountability. And the board, once deferential, grew cold. Within days, her suspension became final. Her title was gone. Her access revoked. The sister who had once rewritten history was now a footnote in it. And Rowan? She didn't take the CEO seat. She declined the board's offer. Instead, she returned to the lab, to the code, to the quiet space where her genius had always lived. Lintech didn't need a symbol. It needed a soul. And the soul had come home. Still, there were days when the ache returned. Of betrayal, of grief, of all the moments lost. But there was healing too, in truth, in the slow rebuilding of trust, in knowing that justice, even delayed, is never wasted. Rowan didn't rise to take revenge. She rose to reclaim what should never have been stolen. And this time, no one could erase her name. The banners read, "Legacy Restored," fluttering softly in the spring breeze outside Lintech's headquarters. It wasn't just a title, it was a promise, a reckoning, and at last, a homecoming. Inside the main auditorium, the lights were gentle, the atmosphere reverent. It didn't feel like a corporate celebration, it felt like a tribute. To resilience, to truth, to Rowan Lin. She stood just off stage, heart pounding beneath her blazer, watching the room fill with faces. Some familiar, some new, some aged by the same battles she had quietly survived. A year ago, she had been erased. Today, she was being welcomed as what she had always been: co-founder, architect, visionary. The MC's voice came through the speakers. Tonight, we honor a name that was once pushed into the margins of our history. But the foundation of Lintech, its integrity, its innovation, its very DNA, was shaped equally by Celeste Lin's two daughters. Please join me in welcoming back, formally and forever, Rowan Lin. The room stood. Applause swelled. Not polite or performative, but heartfelt. A standing ovation, born of recognition, long overdue. Rowan stepped into the light. She didn't speak right away. Her eyes swept over the crowd: executives, engineers, interns, turned directors, and the quietly aging receptionist who had once slipped her candy during late nights at the office. They were all here, and they remembered. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled, not from nerves, but from the depth of the moment. For a long time, I thought silence was safer than the truth. I thought stepping back was the only way to keep peace. But truth has its own heartbeat. It keeps knocking until you answer. She paused, then smiled gently. And tonight, I'm here not just to reclaim the past, but to thank all of you who kept a piece of it alive for me. What followed wasn't just a speech, it was a cascade of remembrance. One by one, former colleagues came forward. A systems engineer showed a diagram annotated by Rowan, explaining how her design had stabilized the company's earliest platform. A data scientist held up a weathered whiteboard photo, with her calculations scrawled in green marker. A former intern read from an old Slack exchange where Rowan had gently taught him a core principle of data integrity. Lessons he now passed on to his own team. No bitterness, no blame, just memory made whole again. The final presentation was a surprise: a digital timeline projected onto the wall, mapping Lintech's growth year by year. For every milestone, a name. For every breakthrough, a signature. And finally, at the top of the founding page, bold and unerasable: Celeste Lin, Calista Lin, Rowan Lin. The crowd stood again, some with tears, some with quiet pride, all bearing witness. That night, the company didn't just restore Rowan's name, it restored its soul. And as she stepped down from the stage, handshakes and embraces surrounding her, Rowan felt something she hadn't in years. As the evening light dimmed outside the auditorium, the final words of the Legacy Restored event belonged to Rowan. She stood at the podium once more, not as a victim, not as someone avenging a loss, but as a woman who had reclaimed her truth. The room fell into a hush, a stillness that honored the gravity of what she was about to say. Her voice was steady, not triumphant, but resolute, like someone who had walked through fire and come out whole, not hardened. "I didn't come back for revenge," she began, pausing to let the words sink in. "I came back for the truth. And I want you to know, choosing truth over vengeance isn't weakness. It's strength. It's clarity. It's the only path that lets us rise without becoming the thing that tried to silence us." There was no bitterness in her tone. Only truth. Only a quiet, unshakable strength. For a long time, I thought dignity meant staying silent. That somehow, if I just let it go, I'd be the bigger person. But silence isn't always dignity. Sometimes, dignity is knowing when to speak, when to stand up, when to stop allowing your name to be written out of your own story. She looked across the crowd, into the faces of colleagues, strangers, friends, and perhaps those who still struggled with their own silencing. If you've ever been erased, if your work was taken, your name overlooked, your voice dismissed, I want you to hear me clearly. You matter. You always have. And it is never too late to reclaim your voice. Not to destroy, but to rebuild. Not to shame, but to restore. There was a stillness in the air, the kind that happens when people realize they're witnessing something they'll remember for the rest of their lives. I didn't win by fighting dirty. I didn't win by becoming ruthless. I won by refusing to disappear. She folded the speech she hadn't read from, just notes, never needed. She had spoken from the heart. This journey has taught me that truth, though quiet at first, always finds its way. It will echo through injustice, through betrayal, through time. And when it finally arrives, it heals. Her final words were a call, not to war, not to bitterness, but to light. Stand, speak, reclaim, even if your voice shakes, even if they tell you it's too late, even if you're the only one at first. Truth is never alone for long. The crowd rose once again, not just in applause, but in affirmation. Many with tears, some with hands over hearts, because her words weren't just about her, they were about all of them. That night, Rowan didn't end a story. She opened a door, and through it, 1,000 silenced voices began to find their way home.